I had learned long ago that survival requires silence. The kind of silence that wraps around your throat like silk, pretty and suffocating all at once, until you forget what your own voice sounds like when it tells the truth. The carriage that brought me to Ashford Manor rattled over cobblestones slick with October rain, and I pressed my gloved hand against the fogged window, watching the great house emerge from the mist like a ghost made of stone and ambition. 3 stories of gray granite, windows like watchful eyes, gardens that sprawled into the distance where the moorland began. It was the kind of beauty that made you feel small, unworthy, exactly the sort of place where women like me came to disappear. The housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, met me at the servants' entrance with the expression of someone inspecting a purchase she had not wanted to make. She was a tall woman, angular and precise, with silver hair pulled so tightly into a bun that it seemed to stretch her face into permanent disapproval. Her eyes traveled over my simple gray traveling dress, my worn leather valise, the absence of jewelry at my throat. I could see her calculating my worth in seconds, the way one might assess a bolt of fabric or a bushel of apples. "You are Miss Clara Whitmore," she said, not quite a question. "The governess." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice steady, my gaze respectfully lowered. I had been Clara Whitmore for 3 years now, long enough that the name almost felt real. She made a small sound in her throat, something between acknowledgement and skepticism, then turned sharply on her heel. "Follow me. His Grace does not tolerate tardiness or incompetence. The children require structure, discipline, and moral instruction. You will take your meals with the upper servants, attend chapel on Sundays, and under no circumstances will you engage in gossip or improper conduct. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, ma'am." The corridors inside were dimly lit despite the afternoon hour, lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow my progress. The air smelled of beeswax and old wood and something else, something harder to name. Loneliness, perhaps. The particular loneliness of a house too large for the people living inside it. Mrs. Daventry led me through a maze of passageways until we reached the nursery wing on the 3rd floor. 2 children sat at a table near the window, a boy of perhaps 9 and a girl no older than 6. They looked up as we entered, their expressions carefully neutral in that way children learn when they have been disappointed too many times to expect kindness. "Master Edmund and Lady Beatrice," Mrs. Daventry announced. "This is Miss Whitmore. She will be overseeing your education and conduct. You will address her properly and obey her instructions without question." The boy, Edmund, studied me with dark eyes that seemed far too old for his face. His sister simply stared, small hands folded in her lap like a miniature portrait of propriety. Neither smiled, neither spoke. "I will leave you to become acquainted," Mrs. Daventry said, already moving toward the door. "Supper is at 6 in the servants' hall. Do not be late." Then she was gone, and I was alone with 2 children who looked at me as if I were just another temporary fixture in a house that had seen too many temporary things. I set down my valise and moved slowly to the chair across from them, settling into it with deliberate care. The boy watched my every movement. The girl picked at the lace on her sleeve. "I understand you have had several governesses before me," I said quietly. "I am not here to replace them or to pretend I know everything about who you are, but I am here, and I would very much like to be your friend, if you will allow it." Edmund's expression flickered, just slightly. "Governesses are not supposed to be friends," he said. His voice was careful, measured. "They are supposed to teach us Latin and scripture, and how to behave at table." I smiled, just a little. "Is that what the others tried to do?" "Yes." "And did it work?" He glanced at his sister, something passing between them that I could not quite read. "No," he admitted. "They all left." "Why?" He hesitated, then lifted his chin in a gesture that reminded me painfully of someone I had once known, someone whose face I was not supposed to remember. "Because Father does not want us." Beatrice made a small sound, almost a whimper, and Edmund immediately reached over to take her hand. The gesture was so protective, so full of quiet desperation, that I felt something crack inside my chest. "I am certain that is not true," I said, though I had no certainty of anything except that children should never have to believe themselves unwanted. Edmund's laugh was bitter, wrong in the mouth of a boy so young. "You have not met him yet. He barely knows we exist. He travels constantly. London, Brighton, Paris, anywhere but here, and when he is here, we are to be silent and invisible. Those are the rules." I sat back slowly, absorbing this. I had known when I accepted this position that the Duke of Ashford was a widower, that he had a reputation for coldness and reclusiveness after his wife's death 5 years prior. I had not known he was also cruel in the particular way that neglect makes cruel. "Well then," I said carefully, "perhaps we shall have to find ways to be less invisible, starting with this." I reached into my valise and withdrew a small wooden box, one of the few possessions I had carried with me through 3 years of running. Inside were watercolor paints, barely used, and a set of brushes. I had bought them in a moment of foolish hope in my first month as Clara Whitmore, thinking I might have time for such things. I never had. Beatrice's eyes widened. She leaned forward, her small face suddenly animated. "Paints," she whispered. "Do you like to paint?" She nodded eagerly, then caught herself and glanced at her brother as if seeking permission. "Our mother used to paint," Edmund said quietly, "before she died." There was something raw in his voice, something that made me understand that grief in this house was not a finished thing, but an ongoing wound. "Then perhaps she would be glad to know you might learn as well," I said, pushing the box across the table toward them. "We can start tomorrow if you like. After lessons." For the first time, something like hope flickered across Edmund's face. "You will not leave?" he asked. Like the others, I met his gaze steadily. "I have nowhere else to go," I said, and it was the most honest thing I had said in 3 years. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, listening to the rain against the window and the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor below. The room was small but clean, furnished with a single bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair. My few belongings fit easily into the trunk at the foot of the bed. I had become very good at living in small spaces, at needing nothing, at leaving no trace of myself behind. But as I stared at the ceiling, I could not stop thinking about Edmund's question. "You will not leave." I had left before. I had left the only place I had ever truly belonged, the only person I had ever truly loved, because staying would have destroyed us both. I had left in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on my back and a secret growing inside me that I could tell no one, least of all him. I pressed my hand against my stomach, against the flat emptiness where life had once been. 3 years, and the ache had not diminished. 3 years. And I still woke sometimes reaching for the weight that should have been in my arms, the warmth that should have been against my chest, the child I had carried for 7 months before everything went wrong, the child I had delivered alone in a charity hospital while rain hammered against the windows and a stern-faced midwife told me not to cry, that girls like me should have known better, the child who had taken 3 breaths and then none at all, too small, too early, too fragile for this hard world. My daughter. I had named her Rose in my heart, though no name was ever written in any register. No stone marked her grave in the paupers' cemetery where they took her. She had existed only for me, only in those brief moments when I held her and felt her impossibly tiny fingers curl around mine. Only in the weeks afterward, when my arms felt so empty, I thought I might die from the weight of that emptiness. I had thought about dying. About walking into the Thames and letting the water close over my head. About simply ceasing to exist because existing without her was a pain I had no words for. But I had not died. I had become someone else instead. Clara Whitmore, governess. A woman with no past, no family, no history worth mentioning. A woman who moved from house to house, teaching other people's children, sleeping in small rooms, speaking in soft voices, leaving no trace. It was safer this way. For me, for him, for the memory of what we had been before the world made it impossible. The footsteps in the corridor grew closer, then stopped outside my door. I held my breath, listening. A long silence, as if someone stood there considering whether to knock. Then the footsteps retreated, fading back into the depths of the house. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes. Tomorrow I would begin teaching Edmund and Beatrice. Tomorrow I would navigate the invisible rules of this house, the hierarchies of servants and family, the careful dance of being present but not too present, helpful but not familiar. Tomorrow I would be Clara Whitmore, competent and invisible and safe. But tonight, alone in the dark, I let myself remember. Just for a moment. Just long enough to whisper a name I had not spoken aloud in 3 years. James. The Duke of Ashford's given name. The name of the man I had loved when he was merely the Earl's second son, before inheritance and tragedy had transformed him into something untouchable. The name of the man who did not know he had once made me pregnant, who did not know our daughter had existed, who did not know I had spent 3 years trying to forget him and failing with every breath. I had taken this position not knowing it was his house. The advertisement had listed only the title, the location, the requirements. I had not connected it to him until Mrs. Daventry mentioned his frequent travels, his coldness with his children, his widowhood. Then the pieces had fallen into place with terrible clarity. James was here, the man I had loved and lost, the father of the child I had buried. And he had no idea I existed. I should leave. I knew that. I should invent some excuse and disappear again before he returned from wherever his travels had taken him, before I had to stand in his presence and pretend to be a stranger, before the sight of him broke open everything I had sealed shut inside myself. But Edmund's voice echoed in my mind. Father does not want us. They all left. Those children had already been abandoned too many times. By their mother through death. By their father through grief and absence. By every governess who had decided they were too difficult, too sad, too much trouble. I could not be another person who left them, even if staying meant I would have to face him, even if staying meant I would have to look into the eyes of the man I had loved and pretend I felt nothing. Even if staying meant living every day with the weight of secrets that could destroy us both. I turned onto my side, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass. Somewhere in this vast house, 2 children slept in rooms that probably felt too large, too empty, too full of echoes. Somewhere else, perhaps in London or Paris or some other distant city, a duke moved through his life unaware that the woman who had once held his heart was now sleeping under his roof. Tomorrow would come regardless. I would meet it as Clara Whitmore, because that was who I had to be. But tonight, I let myself grieve. For Rose. For James. For the girl I had been before loss taught me how to disappear. The footsteps returned in the early hours before dawn, slow and deliberate, pausing again outside my door. This time I did not hold my breath. This time I simply listened as they stood there, silent and still, before finally moving on. It was only later, much later, that I would understand what those footsteps meant, that the house held more secrets than mine, that I was not the only one wearing a disguise, that sometimes the people we are running from are also running toward us, and the collision, when it comes, changes everything. The first week passed in a rhythm of small routines and smaller victories. Edmund proved to be a clever student, hungry for knowledge but suspicious of praise, as if expecting every kindness to be retracted. Beatrice was quieter, more fragile, but she came alive when we worked with the watercolors, her small hands steady as she painted flowers and birds with surprising delicacy. They were good children, lonely children, the kind who had learned to protect themselves by expecting nothing. I took my meals in the servants' hall with the upper staff, a somber gathering of the butler, Mr. Graves, the housekeeper, Mrs. Daventry, the lady's maid, Miss Hartley, who had no lady to attend, and the head cook, Mrs. Morrison. They spoke little, ate efficiently, and regarded me with the polite distance reserved for someone who existed between worlds, neither family nor truly one of them. I did not mind. I had grown accustomed to existing in the spaces between things, but it was the lower servants who puzzled me. There seemed to be more of them than a household of this size required, moving through the corridors with an odd purposefulness, appearing and disappearing like shadows. One in particular caught my attention, a tall footman with dark hair and an unusually quiet manner. Unlike the others, he never spoke during meals in the lower servants' hall, which I glimpsed only in passing. He moved through the house as if studying it, his eyes taking in everything, missing nothing. I first noticed him on my third day, when I was walking with the children through the portrait gallery. He was standing before a large painting of a severe-looking gentleman in military dress, staring at it with an intensity that seemed out of place for someone whose job was to carry trays and open doors. When he sensed our approach, he turned away quickly, his posture shifting into the careful deference of servitude. Edmund barely glanced at him. Beatrice did not seem to see him at all. But I found myself watching as he walked away, something about him nagging at the edges of my awareness like a word on the tip of my tongue. That evening, as I was putting the children to bed, Edmund asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Miss Whitmore, do you think it is possible for someone to become a completely different person?" I paused in the act of straightening his blankets. "What do you mean?" He stared at the ceiling, his young face serious. If someone had to pretend to be someone else for a very long time, would they forget who they really were? Would the pretending become real? I sat down slowly on the edge of his bed. "I think," I said carefully, "that we are always ourselves, even when we wear masks. But sometimes we wear the masks for so long that we forget there is a face underneath. Have you ever worn a mask, Miss Whitmore?" The question was asked with such directness, such innocence, that I could not lie. "Yes," I said quietly. "I have." "Why?" "Because the truth was too dangerous. Because I had to protect someone I loved. Because sometimes survival requires us to become someone else." He turned his head to look at me then, and in his eyes I saw understanding far beyond his years. "I think Father wears a mask too," he said. "I think he forgot how to take it off." "What makes you think that?" "Because sometimes, late at night, I hear him walking in the corridor. And he sounds lost. Like he is looking for something he cannot find." My heart contracted painfully. "Your father is here?" "I thought he was traveling. He returned 2 days ago, but he keeps to his study and his chambers. We are not to disturb him." So the Duke was in residence. James was here, somewhere in this house, close enough that I might encounter him at any moment. The knowledge made my hands tremble as I finished tucking Edmund in and moved to Beatrice's bed to kiss her forehead. "Sleep well, little ones," I whispered. As I left the nursery, I found my steps slowing in the corridor. Somewhere in this vast house, James was awake, walking, searching for something he could not name. The boy I had loved had become a man who wore masks, who avoided his own children, who moved through his home like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. What had the years done to him? What had grief and duty and loneliness carved away from the person he had been? I should not care. I should not let myself wonder. But standing there in the dim corridor with the sound of rain beginning again outside, I felt the old pull, the old ache, the old impossible hope that maybe somehow we might find our way back to each other. Foolish, dangerous, impossible. I returned to my room and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come. Finally, near midnight, I rose and wrapped my shawl around my shoulders, thinking to go down to the kitchen for warm milk. The house was silent except for the rain and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I moved quietly through the corridors, not wanting to wake anyone. The kitchen was empty and still warm from the banked fires. I found milk in the cold larder and was heating it in a small pot when I heard footsteps approaching. I turned quickly, expecting to see Mrs. Morrison or perhaps one of the scullery maids. Instead, it was the quiet footman, the one I had noticed watching the portrait. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the single candle I had lit. "Forgive me," I said quickly. I could not sleep. I thought some warm milk might help. He said nothing for a long moment, just stood there studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. Then he stepped into the kitchen, moving to the other side of the room with careful deliberation. "You are the new governess," he said finally. His voice was low, cultured, completely wrong for a footman. "Miss Whitmore?" "Yes," I replied, uneasiness stirring in my chest. "And you are?" A pause, weighted with something I could not name. No one of consequence, just a servant. But the way he said it, the irony in his tone, told me that was not quite true. I studied him more carefully in the candlelight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with strong features and dark eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds of thought behind them. His hands, I noticed, were not the rough, calloused hands of someone who had spent his life in service. They were well kept, elegant even. "You do not sound like a footman," I said before I could stop myself. His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "And you do not sound like a governess. At least, not one born to the position." My breath caught. "What do you mean?" He moved closer, and I caught the scent of him, something clean and faintly familiar that made my heart stutter. "Your accent," he said quietly. "It is educated, refined. You have read extensively, traveled perhaps. You speak as someone who has known a different life." I forced myself to hold his gaze. "We all have our secrets," I said. "Do we not?" "Indeed." He reached past me to take a cup from the shelf, his arm brushing against mine for the briefest moment. The contact sent a shock through me that I did not understand. Some of us more than others. "Why are you really here?" I asked, the words escaping before wisdom could stop them. "In this house. You are not what you pretend to be." He went very still. "Neither are you." We stood there in the dimness, two people wearing false names and false faces, recognizing in each other the particular wariness of those who have something to hide. The milk began to bubble in the pot, and I turned quickly to remove it from the heat, grateful for the excuse to break that unsettling eye contact. "The children are fond of you already," he said after a moment, his tone shifting to something softer. "Edmund told one of the maids that you are the first governess who has treated them as if they matter." "They do matter," I said fiercely. "They matter very much. It is criminal that they have been made to feel otherwise." "I agree." "Then perhaps you should tell their father that. Tell the Duke that his children need him, not his absence." The silence that followed was so profound that I turned to look at him. His expression had changed, become harder, more guarded. Something flickered in his eyes that might have been pain. "The Duke," he said slowly, "is not easily reached. He has built walls that even his own children cannot breach. Then someone must find a way through those walls, before it is too late, before those children believe they are as unwanted as they feel. And if the Duke himself does not know how to dismantle what he has built, if he is trapped inside those walls as surely as anyone outside them." I stared at him, something shifting in my perception. The way he spoke, the way he held himself, the deep knowledge in his voice when he talked about the Duke's isolation. "Then perhaps he needs someone brave enough to show him the way out," I said quietly. He looked at me for a long moment, and I had the strangest sensation of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in 3 years. As if this man, Whoever he really was could perceive the shape of me beneath Clara Whitmore's carefully constructed surface. "You are that brave," he asked, "to confront a duke, to challenge his choices. I am brave enough to stand up for two children who deserve better, whatever the cost. Even if the cost is your position here, your safety. Even then." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from handsome to devastating. I found myself gripping the edge of the table to steady myself against the sudden rush of feeling in my chest. "Then perhaps there is hope for this house after all," he said. "God knows it needs some." Before I could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, approaching rapidly. The footman moved quickly to the opposite side of the kitchen, his posture shifting instantly back into servitude. Mrs. Daventry appeared in the doorway, her severe face drawn into disapproval. "Miss Whitmore, what are you doing in the kitchen at this hour?" "I could not sleep," I said, holding up my cup of milk. "I apologize for the disturbance." Her gaze moved to the footman, then back to me, suspicion evident in every line of her body. "In this house, we maintain proper boundaries between staff. You will return to your room immediately." "Yes, ma'am." I left the kitchen without looking back at the footman, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away. All the way up the stairs and down the corridor to my room, I felt the weight of that gaze, the mystery of who he really was, and why his presence disturbed me in ways I could not quite name. It was only later, lying awake in the darkness, that I allowed myself to acknowledge the terrible suspicion forming in my mind. The cultured voice, the elegant hands, the intimate knowledge of the Duke's state of mind, the way he had looked at the portrait in the gallery with such intensity. No, it could not be. It was impossible. But the seed of doubt, once planted, would not be uprooted. The next morning, I took the children for a walk in the garden despite the gray skies and threat of more rain. Beatrice needed fresh air and color for her painting, and Edmund had been looking pale, too many hours spent indoors. We walked along the gravel paths between beds of late-blooming roses and chrysanthemums, their petals heavy with moisture from the night's rain. "Miss Whitmore," Edmund said suddenly, stopping before a stone bench. "This is where our mother used to sit. She would bring us here when we were very small, and she would tell us stories about the flowers." I sat down on the bench, and the children settled on either side of me. "What kind of stories?" "She said that every flower has a secret name," Beatrice offered quietly, "a name that only children can hear if they listen very carefully." "And did you hear them?" She nodded solemnly. "The roses are called Remember. The lilies are called Forgive. The forget-me-nots are called Come Back." My throat tightened. "Those are beautiful names." Edmund was quiet, staring at the flower beds with an expression far too old for his face. "Father stopped coming to the garden after she died," he said. "I think it hurt him too much to remember." "Love often hurts the most when we remember," I said softly. "But that does not mean we should forget. Your mother would want you to remember her here, in this place she loved." "Do you think she can see us?" Beatrice asked. "From heaven. Do you think she knows we miss her?" I pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think love does not end when someone leaves us. I think it continues, in our hearts and in the world around us, in every beautiful thing that reminds us of them, even after a long time, even after years and years, even then." We sat there together in the gray morning light, three people bound by different kinds of loss, finding small comfort in each other's presence. I thought of Rose, of James, of all the love I had carried and lost and carried still, transformed but undiminished. Perhaps that was what survived of us in the end. Not our names or our faces or the lives we had lived, but the love we had given and received, the ways we had touched other hearts and been touched in return. A sound made me look up. The quiet footman stood at the edge of the garden, partially hidden by a hedge, watching us. When our eyes met, he did not look away. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, deliberately, into the open. Edmund noticed him and straightened. "That is the new footman," he said. "He has been here only a few days. Father hired him personally, which is strange. Father never involves himself in hiring servants." My pulse quickened. "Did your father interview him himself?" "I do not know. But Mr. Graves said it was most irregular." The footman approached, and I rose from the bench, positioning myself slightly in front of the children in an instinctive gesture of protection. He stopped a respectful distance away, his expression neutral. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "Mrs. Daventry sent me to inform you that the dressmaker has arrived with the new clothes for the children. She requests your presence in the nursery." "Thank you," I said stiffly. "We will return immediately." But Edmund had moved forward, studying the footman with open curiosity. "Do I know you?" he asked. "You seem familiar." The footman's expression flickered just for an instant. "I have one of those faces, young master, easily confused with others." "No," Edmund insisted. "It is your eyes. They are like—" He stopped, his face going pale. "They are like father's eyes." The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice's small hand found mine and gripped it tightly. The footman stood frozen, his careful mask slipping just enough for me to see the truth underneath. And in that moment, I knew. I knew with absolute certainty what I had suspected the night before, but had not wanted to believe. The footman standing before me, wearing plain livery and pretending to be a servant in his own house, was James. The Duke of Ashford, the man I had loved and lost, the father of my dead child. Here, real, close enough to touch, and he had no idea who I was. I felt the world tilt, felt my carefully constructed defenses begin to crack. 3 years of running, of hiding, of pretending to be someone else, and here we stood in his garden, separated by secrets and disguises and the terrible weight of everything we did not say. "You should return to your duties," I managed to say, my voice barely steady. "We will go to the nursery now." He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw recognition beginning to stir in his eyes, a question forming. But Edmund tugged at my hand, and Beatrice was already moving toward the house, and I turned away before that recognition could become understanding. Before he could see my face clearly enough to remember. Before everything we had both built to protect ourselves came crashing down around us. But as I walked away, his voice followed me, soft and wondering and full of something that might have been hope, or fear, or both. Wait. I did not wait. I could not. Not yet. Not until I understood what it meant that he was here, disguised as a servant in his own home, watching his children from a distance, unable or unwilling to close the gap between who he had been and who he had become. Not until I understood whether the man I had loved still existed somewhere beneath the Duke's cold mask. Not until I knew if there was any possibility of redemption for either of us, or if we were both too broken, too lost, too changed by grief to ever find our way back to each other. The rain began again as we reached the house, soft and relentless, washing over the gardens and the stone paths and the windows behind which two people stood in separate rooms, remembering the same past and dreading the same future. I did not sleep that night. I could not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the garden, the way recognition had begun to dawn in his expression before I fled. Every time I tried to quiet my racing thoughts, I heard his voice calling after me. Wait, why was he doing this? Why would a duke disguise himself as a servant in his own house? What was he searching for that required such deception? And more terrifying than any of those questions, how long before he realized who I was? 3 years had changed me. I was thinner now, my face leaner, my hair darker from the cheap dye I used to disguise its original chestnut color. I wore spectacles I did not need, kept my posture carefully hunched, my voice pitched slightly lower than its natural register. I had become very good at being invisible, at presenting a version of myself that invited no second glances, no deeper scrutiny. But James had always been able to see through my defenses. Even when we were young, even when I had tried to hide my feelings behind propriety and careful distance, he had known. He had looked at me across a ballroom 5 years ago and seen straight through to the truth of what I felt. Would he see through Clara Whitmore just as easily? The question haunted me as dawn broke gray and cold over the moors. I rose and dressed mechanically, my hands shaking as I pinned my hair into its severe knot. In the small mirror above my washstand, Clara Whitmore stared back at me, a stranger wearing my face. How long could I maintain this pretense? How long before the mask slipped and he saw what lay beneath? The children were subdued at breakfast, picking at their porridge in silence. Edmund kept glancing at me as if wanting to ask questions he did not know how to voice. Beatrice had drawn a picture during her morning lessons, a dark figure standing alone in a garden, watching a house from a distance. "Is that the footman?" I asked gently, studying the drawing. She nodded. "He looked sad," she said. Like he wanted to come closer, but could not remember how. From the mouths of children, I thought. Sometimes they saw more clearly than any adult. That afternoon, Mrs. Daventry summoned me to her sitting room with a terseness that suggested trouble. I went with my heart pounding, certain that somehow my identity had been discovered, that I would be dismissed, sent away before I had time to prepare. But when I entered the small, precisely ordered room, she merely gestured to a chair and said, "The Duke wishes to dine with his children tonight, in the family dining room. You will have them ready at 7 o'clock precisely. Their best clothes, perfect manners, absolute obedience. Is that clear?" The Duke, not the footman. So he was revealing himself, stepping back into his role. Why now? What had changed? "Yes, ma'am," I said. "They will be ready. See that they are." His Grace has been in a strange mood since his return. Restless, watching everything. I do not pretend to understand his purposes, but I know he does not tolerate disappointment. After she dismissed me, I went directly to the nursery and told the children. Edmund's face went carefully blank, the expression of someone preparing for pain. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "We have not dined with father since mother died," Edmund said quietly. He said it was too difficult, that seeing us reminded him too much of her. "Perhaps he is ready now," I offered, though I doubted my own words. "Perhaps he wants to know you better, or perhaps he wants to send us away, to school or to relatives. That is what happens to inconvenient children, is it not?" I knelt before him and took his hands. "Whatever happens tonight, remember that you are not inconvenient. You are precious. You are loved. And no matter what your father says or does not say, that truth does not change." "Do you love us, Miss Whitmore?" Beatrice asked in a small voice. The question pierced me. "Yes," I said. "I do. Even though you have only known us a little while. Love does not require long acquaintance to take root. Sometimes it happens in an instant. Sometimes it grows slowly over time. But once it exists, it is real, regardless of how it began." Edmund studied me with those two old eyes. "You are talking about more than just us," he said. "Aren't you?" I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, unable to answer directly. "Come, we must choose what you will wear. We must make you look like the remarkable young people you are." I dressed them carefully. Edmund in a dark blue suit that brought out the color of his eyes. Beatrice in a white dress with lace at the collar and cuffs. I brushed her hair until it shone and tied it back with a silk ribbon. I made sure Edmund's collar was straight and his shoes properly polished. They looked beautiful. Perfect. Like little aristocrats from a painting. But their faces remained anxious, and no amount of careful grooming could hide the fear in their eyes. At 10 minutes before 7, I walked them down to the family wing of the house, a part of the manor I had not yet entered. The corridors here were wider, more richly appointed, hung with better paintings and lit by crystal sconces. This was where the family lived, separate from the servants' world, separate from everything common or ordinary. The dining room was magnificent. A long mahogany table, tall windows overlooking the gardens, a chandelier that caught the candlelight and scattered it in 1,000 brilliant fragments. 3 places had been set, clustered at one end of the table. The children's places. An adult chair sat empty at the head. A footman I did not recognize, a real footman, stood by the door. He nodded to me stiffly. "His Grace will arrive shortly. You are dismissed." "But the children," I protested, "will be perfectly safe. You are not required at this dinner. Return to the nursery." Edmund's hand tightened on mine, and I saw the panic flare in his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "Please do not leave us." I looked at the footman, at the rigid set of his shoulders, the implacable authority in his expression. Then I looked at the children, at their frightened faces, and made my decision. "I will wait in the corridor," I said firmly. "If I am needed." The footman's mouth thinned with disapproval, but he did not argue. Perhaps he saw the same thing I saw in the children's faces. Perhaps he was not entirely without compassion. I settled the children in their chairs and squeezed both their hands. "You will be wonderful," I told them. "Just be yourselves. That is all anyone can ask." Then I stepped out into the corridor and positioned myself near the door, close enough to hear if something went wrong. My heart was hammering so hard I felt dizzy. In moments, James would enter that room. James no longer disguised. James in his full authority as Duke and father. James, who I had not seen in his true self for 3 years. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. I should leave. I should walk away now, return to the nursery, maintain my distance and my disguise. But I could not abandon Edmund and Beatrice, could not leave them to face this reunion alone. Footsteps approached from the opposite end of the corridor, slow, measured, heavy with reluctance. I shrank back against the wall, into a small alcove where shadows pooled thick. Through the gap in the doorway, I could see the table, the children sitting rigidly in their chairs, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The door opened fully, and James walked into the dining room. He had changed from his footman's livery into evening dress, black coat and white shirt, every inch the Duke. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing the strong lines of his features, the sharp cheekbones and firm jaw. He was older than I remembered, lines of weariness etched around his eyes and mouth. But he was still beautiful in that austere, remote way that had always made my heart ache. He stopped when he saw the children, his expression carefully controlled. Then he moved to his seat at the head of the table and sat with the deliberate care of someone handling something fragile. "Edmund, Beatrice, it has been some time since we shared a meal." His voice was formal, distant. Edmund swallowed visibly. "Yes, father." An awkward silence fell. Servants entered with the first course, placing dishes with practiced efficiency before retreating. James made no move to eat. Neither did the children. "I understand you have a new governess," James said finally. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, father," Edmund replied. "She is very kind." Something flickered across James's face. "Kind. That is good. You deserve kindness." The words seemed to pain him. Beatrice's lower lip trembled, but she held herself still, her small hands folded perfectly in her lap. "I want you to know," James continued, his voice rougher now, "that I have not been." He stopped, struggling visibly with words that would not come. "I have failed you, both of you, in ways that cannot be easily remedied." Edmund's eyes widened. Beatrice made a small sound, quickly stifled. "Your mother's death," James said, and his voice broke slightly on the words, "destroyed something in me. I could not look at you without seeing her, could not bear the reminder of what I had lost. So I ran. I traveled. I hid from you because I was too cowardly to face my own grief. From my alcove, I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle my own sound of pain. This was not the cold, remote Duke Mrs. Daventry had described. This was a man breaking apart, trying desperately to explain the inexplicable to children who deserved so much more than explanations. "But that was wrong," James continued. "You lost her too. You needed me, and I abandoned you. There is no excuse for that. No apology adequate to that betrayal." Edmund's face crumpled. "Father," he whispered. "When I returned home this time," James said, "I could not bring myself to face you directly. I thought if I observed from a distance, if I saw how you lived without intruding upon it, I might understand what I had done, what I had become. So I disguised myself as a servant." "You wanted to see us without us knowing," Edmund said, understanding dawning in his expression. "You wanted to know if we were all right. I wanted to know if there was anything left worth saving. In this house. In me." He looked directly at his children then, and I saw tears standing in his eyes. "And I discovered that you are extraordinary. Both of you. Kind and clever and resilient despite everything I failed to give you. And I discovered that I am not beyond redemption if you will allow me the chance to try." Beatrice pushed back her chair suddenly and ran to him. She threw her small arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing. James froze for a heartbeat, then his arms came up slowly, carefully, to hold her, his large hands cradling her small body with infinite tenderness. Edmund followed more slowly, but with no less need. He pressed against his father's side, and James pulled him close with his other arm, gathering both children against him and bowing his head over them as his shoulders shook with silent weeping. I turned away, my own tears blinding me. This was private, sacred. A family beginning to heal its terrible wounds. I should not be witnessing it, but as I began to move away, James's voice stopped me. "Whoever is in the corridor, please enter." My heart stopped. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. "Miss Whitmore, I presume. Please come in. I would like to speak with you." There was no escape, no way to refuse without creating more disruption. Slowly, with dread pooling cold in my stomach, I stepped into the doorway. James looked up from where he sat with his children in his arms. His eyes met mine across the candlelit distance, and the world shifted on its axis. I saw the exact moment recognition struck him. His face went absolutely white. His arms tightened convulsively around the children, as if they were the only thing anchoring him to earth. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. "Amelia," he whispered finally, the name a prayer and an accusation all at once. My true name. The name I had not heard spoken aloud in 3 years. The name of the girl who had loved him before duty and scandal and loss had torn us apart. I could not speak, could not move, could only stand there as every carefully constructed wall I had built came crashing down around me. The children looked between us, confusion evident in their faces. Edmund spoke first. "You know Miss Whitmore, Father." James had not taken his eyes from mine. "I did," he said hoarsely. "A long time ago. Before everything." "Why did you call her Amelia?" Beatrice asked. "Because," James said, still holding my gaze with an intensity that scorched, "that is her real name. Miss Whitmore is someone she became. But she was Amelia first. And I loved her. God help me, I loved her more than my own life." The words hung in the air between us, truth and confession and question all at once. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. My mouth formed words that would not come. My mind raced through 1,000 responses and found none adequate to this moment. "You disappeared," James said, his voice breaking. "3 years ago. You vanished without a word, without explanation. I searched for you. I hired investigators. I nearly went mad wondering if you were alive or dead. If I had done something to drive you away. If you had ever truly loved me at all." A sob tore from my throat. "I loved you," I managed. "I never stopped. But I had to leave. I had to." "Why?" His voice was a whip crack of pain and anger and desperate need. "Why, Amelia? What could possibly have been so terrible that you could not trust me with the truth?" The children were watching, listening, trying to understand something far beyond their experience. I could not do this. Not here. Not now. Not with them present. But James rose, gently disentangling himself from Edmund and Beatrice. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood before me, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his eyes, the pulse beating frantically at his throat. "Tell me," he demanded. "After 3 years of silence, after letting me believe you were lost to me forever, you owe me the truth." I looked up at him, at the face I had loved and grieved and carried with me through every dark night of the past 3 years. And I knew that the time for hiding was over, that the reckoning I had feared and dreaded had arrived at last. "I was pregnant," I whispered. "With your child." The blood drained from his face. He swayed as if struck, his hand shooting out to grip the back of a nearby chair for support. "What?" "Before you became Duke, before your brother died and inheritance changed everything, before you married Lady Catherine, I was carrying your baby, our daughter." His breath came in short, sharp gasps. "Where? Where is she? Where is our child?" The tears I had held back for 3 years finally broke free, streaming down my face in hot, unstoppable rivers. "She died," I said, the words ripping from the deepest part of me. "She was born too early, too small. She lived for 3 breaths, and then she was gone. And I buried her alone because I could not tell you, could not burden you with that grief when you were already drowning in duty and expectation and a marriage you never wanted." James made a sound I had never heard from any human throat, a noise of such profound anguish that it seemed to tear the very air. He reached for me blindly and I went to him, let him pull me against his chest as his whole body shook with the force of his grief. "Our daughter," he gasped against my hair. "Our baby. Oh God, Amelia. Oh my God." Behind us, I heard Edmund's small voice. "Father, Miss Whitmore, what is happening?" But neither of us could answer. We stood locked together in the ruins of our shared past. 2 people who had lost everything and found each other again too late to save what mattered most. Or perhaps not too late. Perhaps this was exactly when we needed to find each other. When we were both broken enough to be honest. Both lost enough to understand the cost of love. Both scarred enough to know that healing, when it came, was never simple or easy, but had to be fought for with every breath. James pulled back finally, his hands framing my face, his thumbs wiping away my tears even as his own fell unchecked. "Tell me everything," he said. "Tell me her name. Tell me what she looked like. Tell me every moment I missed. Please. I need to know she existed. I need to know she was real." And so, with his children listening in confused silence and the dinner growing cold on the table, I told him about Rose, about the pregnancy I had hidden, the charity hospital where I had labored alone, the tiny, perfect face of our daughter as she struggled for breath in my arms. I told him about the grief that had nearly destroyed me, the months of wandering when I did not care if I lived or died, the slow, painful process of becoming someone else because being Amelia without him and without our child was too unbearable to sustain. I told him everything, and he listened, his face devastated, his hands never leaving mine, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the silence was absolute. Then Beatrice, sweet, merciful Beatrice, got down from her chair and came to us. She took my hand and her father's hand and pressed them together. "You both lost someone you loved very much," she said with the simple wisdom of a child. "Like we lost mother. Like father lost mother. We are all missing people, but we are all here now, together. Maybe that is what matters." From the mouths of children, I thought again, fresh tears spilling over. Sometimes they understood the essential truth that adults made too complicated. James looked at his daughter, then at his son who had also risen and come to stand with us, then back at me. He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles that felt like a vow. "I cannot change the past," he said hoarsely. "I cannot bring back Rose. I cannot undo the pain we have both endured, but I can offer you this. Stay. Not as Miss Whitmore, as Amelia, as yourself. Stay with me, with us, and let us build something new from the pieces of what we lost." I looked at him, at his children, at the imperfect, broken, beautiful possibility of what we might become. And I thought of Rose, of how she had lived for only 3 breaths but had been so deeply loved in that brief time, of how love did not end when someone left us but continued, transformed, finding new expressions and new forms. "I will stay," I whispered, "if you truly want me, if the children will accept me." Edmund stepped forward. "We already love you, Miss Whitmore. I mean, Amelia. We loved you before we knew who you really were. That will not change." And just like that, in a dining room with cold dinner and guttering candles and hearts broken open and beginning tentatively to heal, we became something new. Not a perfect family. Not an easy answer to complicated grief. But a beginning. A chance. A small, fragile, precious hope that maybe, after everything, love could still find a way. The days that followed were strange and tentative, like walking across ice that might crack at any moment beneath our weight. James insisted I move from the servants' quarters to a guest room in the family wing, a beautiful chamber with rose-colored wallpaper and windows overlooking the gardens. Mrs. Daventry's disapproval was palpable but silent, her lips pressed into a thin line as she supervised the transfer of my meager belongings. The other servants whispered behind their hands, their eyes following me with mixture of curiosity and judgment. I no longer knew what I was in this house. Not quite family, no longer a servant. Something in between, undefined and precarious. James seemed equally unsure of how to navigate this new reality. He was awkward around me in a way that might have been endearing if it were not so painful. We would encounter each other in corridors and pause, searching for words that felt appropriate, settling for polite nods and careful distance. At meals, which we now took together with the children, he sat across from me and looked at me as if I might disappear again if he blinked. The children, paradoxically, adjusted most easily. They began calling me Amelia without hesitation, though Beatrice sometimes slipped and said Miss Whitmore before correcting herself with an apologetic smile. Edmund watched his father and me with something like hope in his eyes, as if he believed we might magically repair all that was broken and create the happy family he had never known. I did not have the heart to tell him that healing was never that simple. A week after the revelation, James asked me to walk with him in the garden. It was late afternoon, the autumn light slanting gold across the lawn, the air crisp with the promise of coming winter. We walked in silence for some time, our shoulders nearly touching but not quite, the space between us charged with everything we had not yet said. Finally, near the bench where the children had told me their mother used to sit, James stopped. He turned to face me, and I saw the exhaustion in his features, the weight of grief he had carried alone for so long. "I need to explain about Catherine," he said quietly. "About my marriage." I shook my head. "You do not owe me explanations. That part of your life is not my concern." "But it is," he insisted, "because you need to understand why I could not come for you." "Why?" Even if I had known about your pregnancy, I could not have prevented my marriage. I sat down on the bench, my legs suddenly unsteady. Very well. Tell me. He remained standing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When my brother died, the title came to me unexpectedly, along with debts I had not known existed. The estate was mortgaged to ruin, Amelia. Another year and we would have lost everything. Ashford Manor, the London house, the tenants' farms, all of it. I had known his brother's death had changed everything, but not this. Not that the inheritance had come wrapped in chains. Catherine's father was a banker, James continued, his voice hollow, wealthy beyond measure and desperate for a title in the family. He offered to pay off every debt to restore the estate's finances, in exchange for my marriage to his daughter. I refused at first. I told him I was in love with someone else, with you. My breath caught. You told him about me. He nodded. I told him I intended to marry you, that I did not care about money or estates or any of it. He laughed. Then he explained very calmly that if I did not marry Catherine, he would not only refuse to help, but would ensure that every creditor called in their debts immediately. Hundreds of tenant families would be evicted. Decades of history would be auctioned off to pay what was owed. He would destroy everything. So you chose the estate, I said, and heard the bitterness in my own voice. I chose hundreds of innocent people over my own happiness. Over our happiness. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I told myself it was the honorable choice, the noble sacrifice. But the truth is, I was a coward. I should have fought harder. Found another way. Instead, I married Catherine and told myself you would be better off without me. And your wife. Did you love her? James closed his eyes. I tried. God knows I tried. She was kind, gentle, everything a duchess should be. She gave me 2 beautiful children. And I failed her in every way that mattered because my heart was never truly hers. She knew it too. On her deathbed, she told me she had always known. That she forgave me, but hoped that someday I would forgive myself. He opened his eyes then, and they were wet with unshed tears. I have not forgiven myself. I doubt I ever will. I destroyed 3 lives with my choices. Yours, hers, my own. And when you disappeared, when I searched for you and could not find you, I thought it was my punishment, that I deserved to live with that loss forever. I stood and moved to him, unable to bear the distance any longer. I took his hands in mine, felt them trembling. You did what you believed was right, what you thought honor demanded. I cannot fault you for that. But if you had known about our child, he said desperately, if I had known, I could have. I would have. What, James? What would you have done? Broken your word to Catherine's father. Destroyed all those families anyway. You were trapped, just as I was trapped. We were both victims of circumstances neither of us could control. He pulled me against him suddenly, fiercely, burying his face in my hair. I should have found you, he whispered. After Catherine died, I should have searched harder, longer. I should never have stopped looking. I was very good at hiding, I murmured against his chest. I did not want to be found. I thought it was kinder to let you believe I had moved on, that I was happy somewhere without you. Were you? He asked. Happy. I pulled back to look at him. How could I be? I lost everything, James. Our child, you, myself. I spent 3 years existing but not living, going through motions but feeling nothing. Until I came here and saw Edmund and Beatrice and remembered what it felt like to love, even if that love came with the risk of more loss. His hands came up to cut my face, his thumbs tracing the lines of my cheekbones with aching tenderness. I want to love you again, he said hoarsely. I want to court you properly, marry you if you will have me, give you the life you should have had from the beginning. But I am afraid that too much has been broken, that too much time has passed, that you will realize you deserve better than a man who failed you so completely." I reached up to cover his hands with mine. "We are both broken, James, both scarred. But perhaps that is exactly why we belong together now, because we understand the cost of love, the weight of loss, the value of second chances. Because we know nothing is guaranteed except this moment, right here, right now." "Then let me have this moment," he whispered, and lowered his mouth to mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, both of us afraid of shattering the fragile new thing growing between us. But then memory flooded through me. The memory of how we had been together before. The passion and tenderness and perfect understanding we had shared. My arms went around his neck and his tightened around my waist, and we kissed like two people drowning who had finally found air. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against mine. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of obligation or duty or anything except this. What we feel. What we have always felt. Marry me and help me become the man I should have been all along." I wanted to say yes immediately, but something held me back, a last vestige of self-protection, a final wall not yet dismantled. "The scandal," I said quietly. "When society learns that the Duke of Ashford is marrying his children's former governess, a woman with no family or fortune or reputation, they will destroy us. Let them try." His voice was fierce. "I have spent 5 years caring what society thinks, living by their rules, sacrificing my happiness for their approval. I am done with that. Amelia, if they choose to condemn us, that is their failing, not ours, and the children. They have already endured so much. To have their father marry someone so far beneath his station, to face the gossip and judgment. The children love you. They want you to stay. Edmund told me yesterday that you are the first person since his mother who has made this house feel like a home." Beatrice drew a picture of all 4 of us together, standing in the garden. "They are not afraid of scandal. They are only afraid of losing you." I felt tears prick my eyes again. I seemed to cry constantly now, as if 3 years of suppressed emotion had finally found release. "What about Rose?" I whispered. "Will you resent me for not telling you, for not giving you the chance to know her?" James's expression crumpled. "I will grieve for her every day of my life. But I do not resent you, Amelia. I understand why you made the choices you did. I only wish I could have been there. To hold you, to hold her, to share that grief instead of you bearing it alone." "She looked like you," I told him, needing him to know. "She had your eyes, your mouth. Even in those few moments, I could see you in her face." He made a choked sound and pulled me close again, and we stood there in the garden where his first wife had once told their children stories about flowers with secret names. We stood and held each other and grieved together for the daughter we had lost, the time we had wasted, the pain we had endured apart that we might now, finally, endure together. That evening, James called the household together in the great hall. Servants and family alike gathered, their faces curious and wary. Mrs. Daventry stood at the front, her disapproval radiating from every line of her rigid posture. The children flanked me on either side, each holding one of my hands. James stood before them all, every inch the Duke now, commanding and sure. "I have an announcement," he said, his voice carrying through the vaulted space. "Miss Whitmore, whom you have known as the governess, is in truth Miss Amelia Hart. She and I were acquainted before my marriage, and circumstances separated us. She has returned to my life, and I intend to marry her." A collective gasp ran through the assembled servants. Mrs. Daventry's face went white, then red. Several of the maids began whispering frantically behind their hands. "I know this is irregular," James continued, his tone brooking no argument. "I know it will cause talk, speculation, perhaps scandal. But I am the Duke of Ashford, and this is my house, and I will marry whom I choose. Anyone who finds this unacceptable is free to seek employment elsewhere with an excellent reference. Anyone who remains will treat Miss Hart with the respect due to the future Duchess. Is that understood?" Silence. Then Mr. Graves, the elderly butler, stepped forward. He bowed deeply, first to James, then to me. "It will be an honor to serve you, Miss Hart," he said clearly. "And may I say, on behalf of the staff, that the house has been brighter since your arrival. We wish you and His Grace every happiness." I felt my throat tighten with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Graves." Others began to murmur their agreement, some more enthusiastically than others. Mrs. Daventry remained stony-faced but offered a stiff curtsy. The maids who had been whispering smiled tentatively, and slowly, gradually, the tension in the room began to ease. That night, after the children were in bed and the house had quieted, I stood at my window looking out over the moonlit gardens. Behind me, the door opened softly. I turned to find James in the doorway, still dressed, his cravat loosened and his hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "I could not sleep," he said. "May I come in?" I nodded, and he entered, closing the door behind him. He crossed to stand beside me at the window, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint scent of sandalwood and smoke that clung to his clothes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "Rose," I admitted. I was imagining what she would have looked like now, at 3 years old. Whether she would have had my temperament or yours. Whether she would have loved books or horses or painting. All the things I will never know. "I think about that too," James said, "since you told me. I imagine her constantly. A little girl with dark curls and green eyes, running through these gardens, laughing." He paused. Do you think she knows?" "Somehow. That we found our way back to each other." "I want to believe that," I said. "I want to believe that love continues after death, that the people we lose are not truly gone but somehow still present, still aware. That Rose knows her parents loved her, even if we could not save her." James took my hand, threading his fingers through mine. "I want to honor her memory," he said. "Not with sadness, though there will always be sadness, but with life, with love, with the family we still have a chance to build. Would that be all right with you?" I turned to face him fully, reading the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear that he might be asking too much too soon. "Yes," I whispered. "I think that is exactly what she would want. For us to live, to love. To not let her brief life be defined only by loss." He pulled me into his arms then, and we stood together in the quiet room, holding each other against the dark. Outside, an owl called from somewhere in the gardens. Inside, 2 hearts that had been broken began, slowly and painfully, to remember how to beat in time. The next morning, I woke to find a small wooden box on my bedside table. Inside was a ring, simple and beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, and beneath it, a note in James's careful hand. This was my grandmother's ring. She told me once to give it only to a woman I loved beyond reason, beyond duty, beyond everything the world might say or think. I should have given it to you 5 years ago. I give it to you now, if you will accept it, along with my promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your forgiveness and your love. Yours always, James. I slipped the ring onto my finger, feeling its weight settle there, solid and real. Then I dressed quickly and went to find him. He was in his study, standing at the window with his back to the door. He turned when he heard me enter, his expression cautious, hopeful, afraid. I crossed the room and held up my hand, showing him the ring on my finger. "Yes," I said simply. "My answer is yes." The smile that broke across his face was like dawn after the longest night. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides and swept me into his arms, lifting me off my feet and spinning me around like we were young again, like we had not lost years to grief and separation, like this moment was the beginning of everything rather than the continuation of something that had been interrupted but never truly ended. When he set me down, we were both laughing and crying at once, joy and sorrow mixed so thoroughly they could not be separated. And perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps that was what love looked like after loss. Not the erasure of pain, but its transformation into something bearable, something beautiful even, because it was shared. Edmund and Beatrice found us there, still holding each other, still smiling through tears. They stopped in the doorway, their faces brightening with understanding. "You are getting married," Edmund said, not quite a question. "We are," James confirmed, reaching out to draw them closer. "All 4 of us. Together. A family." Beatrice clapped her hands with delight, then grew serious. "Does this mean Amelia will be our new mother?" I knelt before her, taking her small hands in mine. "I cannot replace your mother, sweetheart. She will always be your mother, always be loved and remembered. But I can love you if you will let me. I can be here for you. I can be part of your family." She studied my face with the earnest intensity only children possess. "Will you leave us?" she asked. "Like everyone else leaves." I pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling James's hand settle on my shoulder, Edmund pressing close on my other side. "No, darling, I will not leave. This is where I belong now, with all of you, for as long as you will have me." "Forever, then," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "You have to stay forever." "Forever," I agreed, knowing even as I said it that forever was not guaranteed to anyone, that loss could still find us, that grief might return in new forms, but also knowing that this moment, this love, this fragile and precious and hard-won family, was worth every risk, worth every scar, worth every tear we had shed to reach it. We stood together in the morning light streaming through the study windows, 4 broken people learning to be whole again, not by erasing what had wounded us, but by loving each other through and beyond the wounds. Not a perfect family, not an easy happiness, but something real and true and earned through fire. Something worth fighting for, something worth staying for. Something, perhaps, that Rose herself would have blessed if she could have known we had found our way home to each other at last. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a cold December morning when frost painted the windows in delicate patterns and the winter sun turned the gardens to silver. We had chosen to marry quietly in the estate's private chapel, with only the children, a few trusted servants, and the vicar in attendance. James had wanted to wait longer, to give society time to adjust to the idea, to allow me to have the grand celebration he thought I deserved. But I had no desire for spectacle or crowds of strangers pretending approval while whispering scandal behind their hands. I wanted only what mattered: James, the children, and the promise of a future we would build together, one careful day at a time. I wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to James's mother, altered to fit me by a seamstress from the village who had cried when I told her the story of how James and I had found each other again. It was simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a high collar trimmed in delicate lace. Beatrice had woven winter jasmine into my hair, the white flowers a stark and lovely contrast against the dark strands. Edmund stood beside his father at the altar, solemn and proud in his role as witness to this new beginning. As I walked down the short aisle toward James, I thought of Rose. I thought of how she should have been here, a 3-year-old child holding flowers, delighted by the ceremony. I thought of all the moments she would never witness, all the love she would never receive except in memory. And I thought of how love, once given, never truly disappeared, but transformed into new shapes, new expressions, finding ways to continue even after death had claimed its object. I was not betraying her by loving James again. by accepting his children as my own, by choosing happiness after so much grief. I was honoring her. I was proving that her brief life had mattered, that the love created by her existence had been powerful enough to survive loss and separation, and years of silence. That it had been powerful enough to bring two shattered people back together and make them whole again. James's eyes were wet as I reached him. His hand trembled slightly as he took mine. The vicar began the familiar words, the ancient promises that had bound countless couples before us and would bind countless more after. But when it came time for our vows, James stopped him. "May I say something first?" he asked quietly. The vicar nodded, surprised but not displeased. James turned to face me fully, both my hands clasped in his. "Amelia," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see blazing in his eyes, "I have loved you since I was 22 years old, and too foolish to understand what a rare gift that love was. I lost you through my own failure to fight hard enough for what mattered most. I spent 5 years believing I had destroyed any chance of happiness, that I deserved to live with that regret forever. But you came back. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, you returned to my life. And you brought with you not bitterness or accusations, but grace. You loved my children when they had been neglected. You forgave my failures when you had every right to condemn them. You trusted me with the truth of your pain, your loss, our daughter." He paused, swallowing hard. "I cannot promise you a life without sorrow. I cannot promise that the world will be kind, or that we will not face challenges and judgment. But I can promise you this. I will love you with everything I am, every day that I breathe. I will honor Rose's memory by building the family she should have been part of. I will never again choose duty over love, or fear over honesty, or anything at all over you. This I swear, before God and these witnesses, with every fiber of my being." Tears streamed down my face unchecked. I had not prepared words, had thought the traditional vows would be sufficient. But standing there with James's hands holding mine, with Edmund and Beatrice watching with hope-bright faces, with the winter light streaming through stained glass and painting us all in colors of redemption, I found words rising from somewhere deep inside me. "James," I said, and my voice was stronger than I expected, clearer and more certain. "I loved you when we were young and the world seemed full of possibility. I loved you when circumstances tore us apart. I loved you through pregnancy and loss and 3 years of deliberately trying not to love you because loving you hurt too much to bear. I loved you even when I believed I would never see you again. And I love you now, not despite everything that has happened, but because of it. Because we have both walked through fire and emerged scarred, but not destroyed. Because you are human and flawed and brave enough to admit your failures. Because you love your children enough to disguise yourself as a servant, just to know they were safe. Because when you learned about Rose, you did not blame me but grieved with me. I cannot promise that grief will not find us again, or that loving will always be easy, but I can promise that I will choose you, every day, in every way that matters. I will love Edmund and Beatrice as if they were my own. I will build a home with you where honesty is valued more than propriety, where love is stronger than scandal, where loss is acknowledged but does not define us. This I promise you, before God and these witnesses, for all the days of my life." The vicar cleared his throat, clearly moved. "I do not think," he said with a slight smile, "that I need to ask whether you take each other. It seems abundantly clear that you do." A ripple of soft laughter ran through our small gathering. James pulled me close and kissed me there at the altar, before the proper moment, breaking protocol in a way that would have scandalized society, but made our witnesses smile. When we finally pulled apart, he was grinning like a boy, and I felt lighter than I had in years. "We are married," he said wonderingly. "You are my wife." Finally, actually, truly my wife. "And you are my husband," I replied. The answer to a prayer I thought would never be answered. Beatrice rushed forward and hugged us both, her small arms barely reaching around our combined waists. Edmund followed more sedately, but with no less joy evident in his face. We stood together, the four of us, and I felt something settle deep in my chest. This was family. Not blood alone, though blood tied James to his children. Not merely convenience or duty, though those had their place. But choice. The deliberate, conscious, hard-won choice to love and be loved, to stay and be stayed for, to build something that honored both the past and the future. The wedding breakfast was a simple affair in the morning room, just the four of us and Mr. Graves, who had insisted on serving us himself. We ate warm bread and butter, ham and eggs, and a special cake that Mrs. Morrison had baked despite her initial disapproval of the match. By the end, even she had softened, seeing perhaps that love was love regardless of station or circumstance. Afterward, James took me to a part of the garden I had not yet explored, a small walled area overgrown with winter vines and dormant rose bushes. In the center stood a stone bench, and beside it, a newly planted young oak tree. I had this tree brought from the estate's ancient oak wood, he explained. I wanted to plant something in Rose's memory, something that would grow and endure and provide shelter and shade long after we are gone. He turned to me, uncertain. Is that all right? I should have asked you first. I could not speak past the lump in my throat. I simply nodded and moved to the small tree, touching its rough bark with gentle fingers. It was perfect. A living memorial, not a gravestone, but something that would grow and change and continue, just as love continued. I thought, James said quietly, that we might bring the children here sometimes. Tell them about their sister. Make sure they know about her, so that Rose is part of our family's story, not a secret we keep hidden. I turned to him with fresh tears spilling over. Yes, I whispered. Yes, James. That is exactly right. We stood together in the winter garden, two people who had lost and found each other, marking the place where we would remember the daughter we had lost. And though grief would always be part of our story, it was no longer the only part. Now there was also healing, hope, the promise of new growth from old sorrow. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Society did indeed talk. There were women who refused to acknowledge me, invitations that were pointedly not extended, whispers that followed us when we ventured to London for the season. But James stood beside me through all of it, his hand firm in mine, his love a shield against the worst of the judgment. And gradually, slowly, some of the more progressive members of the ton began to accept us, to see that genuine affection could not be legislated by class or circumstance, that a love story did not need to be simple to be true. Edmund flourished under his father's renewed attention, growing confident and bright. Beatrice continued to paint, creating beautiful watercolors that we hung throughout the house. And I learned what it meant to be not just a wife but a mother to children who had known too much loss too young. It was not always easy. There were moments when they pulled away, when grief for their first mother surfaced unexpectedly. There were nights when Beatrice cried for her mama, and all I could do was hold her and let her cry, knowing that loving me did not mean forgetting the woman who had given her life. But there were also moments of piercing joy. The first time Edmund called me mother without correcting himself. The morning Beatrice showed me a painting she had done of all five of us, including a small figure with dark hair and green eyes standing slightly apart, and said simply, "That is Rose. She is part of our family too." The evening James and I stood in the doorway of the nursery watching our children sleep, and he whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for coming back, for giving me a second chance at everything I thought I had lost." On the first anniversary of our wedding, James gave me a gift. It was a small portrait, beautifully painted, of an infant with dark hair and delicate features, wrapped in white linen. He had commissioned it from a description I had given him, working with the artist to capture as closely as possible what Rose had looked like in those brief moments of her life. "So we can remember her face," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "So she is not just a memory, but something we can see. Something real." I held the portrait carefully, tracing the tiny features with my fingertip, and felt grief and gratitude wash over me in equal measure. "Where will we hang it?" I asked. "In our bedroom," he suggested, "where we can see her every day, where she can be part of our private world, even if the public one never knows her." And so she was. The portrait hung on the wall across from our bed, a tiny face watching over us as we slept and woke and lived the life she had never gotten to live. Sometimes I would wake in the night and see James standing before it, his hand pressed against the frame, his shoulders shaking with silent grief. And I would go to him and hold him, and we would grieve together as we had not been able to do when she died, as we should have done from the beginning. But grief was no longer our only companion. There was also Edmund's laughter when his father taught him to ride, Beatrice's delight when we took her to the village fair, the quiet evenings when all four of us gathered in the drawing room, James reading aloud while I sewed, and the children sprawled on the carpet playing quiet games. The ordinary, precious moments that made a life. 2 years after our wedding, I discovered I was pregnant again. The joy was immediate and fierce, but it was also complicated by fear. What if I lost this child too? What if my body could not carry a baby to term? What if I had to endure that grief again, and this time James would have to endure it with me? He held me when I told him, and I felt him trembling. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Terrified," I admitted. "So am I. But we will face it together. Whatever happens, we will face it together." That is the difference this time. The pregnancy was not easy. There were weeks when I had to stay in bed, when every day felt like holding my breath waiting for loss. James barely left my side, bringing me books and tea, reading to me for hours, his hand resting protectively on my growing belly. Edmund and Beatrice were gentle and careful, bringing me flowers from the garden and pictures they had drawn. The whole household seemed to hold its collective breath, hoping and praying and waiting. And then, on a soft spring morning when the gardens were in full bloom and light streamed golden through the windows, our son was born, healthy and strong and wailing with impressive volume. James wept as he held him, this perfect tiny creature that was both a miracle and a testament to everything we had survived to reach this moment. We named him Thomas, after James's grandfather, but his middle name was Rose. Thomas Rose Ashford, a living bridge between the daughter we had lost and the future we were building. Beatrice was enchanted with her baby brother, insisting on helping with everything from bathing to choosing his clothes. Edmund was more reserved but no less devoted, spending hours watching the baby sleep and marveling at how small his fingers were. And I, holding my son in my arms and feeling his warm weight against my chest, understood that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to hold grief and joy simultaneously, to honor what was lost while embracing what remained. On Thomas's christening day, we gathered in the same chapel where James and I had married. After the ceremony, we walked as a family to Rose's tree, which had grown tall and strong in the 3 years since its planting. James carried Thomas while I held Beatrice's hand, and Edmund walked beside us, nearly as tall now as my shoulder. We stood beneath the branches, and James spoke to the child in his arms. "This tree," he said softly, "was planted for your sister Rose. You never met her, but she is part of our family, part of who we are. She lived for only a few moments, but she was deeply loved. And because of her, because of the grief your mother and I survived, we know how precious you are, how precious every moment with you is." Thomas made a small sound, his tiny fist waving in the air. Beatrice giggled and reached out to touch his hand. "He is holding Rose's tree," she said. "Maybe she is holding him back." "Maybe she is," I agreed, looking up through the green leaves to the blue sky beyond. "Maybe she is." We returned to the house together. And I thought about how life was never what we expected, how loss and love were intertwined in ways that could not be separated, how we carried our dead with us, not as burdens, but as parts of ourselves, shaping who we became and how we loved the living. I had been Amelia Hart, a girl in love with a second son who dreamed of a simple, happy future. I had become someone else through grief and necessity, hiding from a past too painful to face. And now I was Amelia Ashford, Duchess, wife, mother to 3 children living and 1 dead. Each version of myself layered over the others, none erased, but all transformed by what came after. That evening, after the children were in bed and Thomas was sleeping in his cradle, James and I stood at the window of our bedroom looking out over the moonlit gardens. His arm was around my waist, my head resting on his shoulder. We did not need words. We had been through too much together, lost too much, and found too much, to need constant conversation. But after a long, comfortable silence, James spoke. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Coming back, revealing yourself." All of this, I turned to look at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that despite everything, I might still wish for a different life. "Not for a single moment," I said firmly. "Do you?" He smiled and pulled me closer. "My only regret is the years we lost. But even those were not wasted, I think. We needed to become who we are now to appreciate what we have, to know its value, to fight for it." I stood on my toes and kissed him softly. "And we will keep fighting for it. Every day, for as long as we both shall live." He returned my kiss with interest, then pulled back to look at me with that intensity that still made my heart race after all this time. "I love you, Amelia Ashford. I loved you when we were young and foolish. I loved you when we were separated and broken. And I love you now, in this life we have built from the ruins of the old. I will love you until I draw my last breath and beyond, if love survives death as I believe it does." "It does," I whispered, thinking of Rose, of how her brief existence still shaped our days, still informed how we loved. Love always survives. It is the one thing stronger than loss, the one thing that endures no matter what tries to destroy it. We stood together in the quiet room, 2 people who had been given a second chance and seized it with both hands. Outside, the wind whispered through Rose's tree. Somewhere in the house, our children slept safe and loved. And here, in this moment, we had everything that mattered. Not a perfect life, not a story without sorrow, but a true one. An earned one. A life worth living and loving and fighting for every single day. Years later, when Edmund was grown and preparing to take on more responsibility for the estate, when Beatrice had married a kind young gentleman who adored her, when Thomas was a laughing boy who climbed Rose's tree with abandon, I would sometimes walk alone to the walled garden. I would sit on the stone bench and look at the tree that had grown tall and broad, providing exactly the shelter and shade James had envisioned. And I would talk to the daughter I had known for only 3 breaths, but had loved for a lifetime. I would tell her about her siblings, about the life we had built, about how her brief existence had been the catalyst for everything beautiful that came after. I would thank her for the gift of her life, short as it was, because that life had taught me that love was worth any price, any pain, any sacrifice. Sometimes James would find me there and sit beside me in silence. Sometimes the children would come, bringing flowers to lay at the tree's base. And sometimes I would be alone, just me and the memory of a tiny, perfect face, and the knowledge that though she was gone, she had never truly left us. On my 50th birthday, when my hair was streaked with silver and my hands were marked by age and work and living, James took me back to that garden one more time. He led me to the tree and pointed to something carved into the bark. I stepped closer and saw words etched carefully into the wood. Rose Amelia Ashford, 3 breaths, forever loved, forever remembered, forever part of us. And beneath that, Another line. Love endures. Always. I traced the letters with shaking fingers, tears streaming down my face. When did you do this? I asked. This morning, he said, while you slept. I wanted you to know that she will be remembered long after we are gone. That anyone who sees this tree will know she existed. That she mattered. I turned into his arms and held him as tightly as I had on our wedding day, on the day Thomas was born, on every day when joy or sorrow or simple ordinary living had required us to cling to each other for strength. Thank you, I whispered, for remembering, for honoring her, for loving me through everything. It is I who should thank you, he said against my hair, for coming back, for staying, for teaching me that redemption is possible, that love can survive anything, that broken people can heal if they are willing to be honest and vulnerable and brave. We stood there beneath Rose's tree as the afternoon light faded into evening. Two people who had loved and lost and loved again, who had been young and then broken, and then slowly, painfully, carefully made whole. Not the same as we had been. Changed by grief, marked by sorrow, shaped by survival. But together, always, always together. And that, I thought as James's arms tightened around me, and I felt the solid, reassuring beat of his heart against mine, was the truest love story of all. Not the fairy tale of happily ever after without complication or cost, but the real story of two people choosing each other again and again, through every challenge and every sorrow, building a life that honored both what they had lost and what they had found. A life that proved love, once given, never truly ended. It transformed, evolved, continued in new forms and new hearts and new generations. It grew like a tree planted in memory, reaching toward the sky but rooted deep in the earth of everything that had come before. Love endured. Despite separation and grief and scandal and time, despite loss and failure and all the ways the world conspired against it, love endured, always and forever, in 3 breaths and a lifetime, in memory and in living, in the daughter we had lost and the children we held close, in every sunrise and every season, in every moment we chose each other over everything else the world had to offer. Love endured, and so did we.